The birthday cake sat like a sugary monument to my sister's perfection in the center of our dining room table, 21 candles flickering against the late afternoon light streaming through windows I had cleaned that morning. Emma looked radiant in the new designer dress our parents had bought her for the occasion, her honey blonde hair catching the light as she laughed at something our father had said. I stood in the doorway, car keys heavy in my hand, already knowing what was coming before the words left my mother's perfectly lipsticked mouth. "Claire, darling, we need to talk to you about something important." Susan's voice carried that particular tone she used when she was about to deliver news that would benefit Emma at my expense. I had heard it countless times over the years. When Emma got my larger bedroom because she needed space to study, when my college fund was redirected to cover Emma's private school tuition because she had more potential, when my part-time job earnings mysteriously disappeared to fund Emma's spring break trip because she deserved to relax after working so hard. I stepped into the dining room, noting how the family portrait on the mantel caught the afternoon light just right, Emma front and center in her graduation cap and gown, our parents beaming with pride on either side of her, while I stood slightly behind them, barely visible in the shadow of their joy. "What is it, Mom?" I asked, though I already knew. The past month had been building to this moment like storm clouds gathering on a summer horizon. David, my father, cleared his throat in the way he did when he was about to say something he knew was unfair, but had already decided to do anyway. "Your sister just got accepted to graduate school. The program she wants is very competitive, and she'll need reliable transportation to get to her internships and research opportunities." Emma's eyes sparkled with barely contained excitement as she turned to look at me. "The Honda you drive would be perfect for me, Claire. It's practical and reliable, and I really need something dependable for this next phase of my life." The audacity of it took my breath away. The Honda Civic wasn't just my car, it was the only thing I truly owned. I had saved every penny from my job at the campus bookstore, worked double shifts on weekends, skipped meals to afford the down payment. I had made every monthly payment on time for 3 years, even when it meant choosing between gas money and groceries. "But Mom, that's my car," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. "I bought it with my own money. I need it for work and school." Susan's expression shifted into what I had learned to recognize as her disappointed mother face, the one that somehow made me feel guilty for existing. "Claire, honey, you have to understand that Emma's opportunities are time-sensitive. She's been accepted to one of the most prestigious graduate programs in the country. This is her chance to really make something of herself." The unspoken implication hung in the air like smoke. "Unlike you. Emma studied so hard for this," David added, his voice taking on the warmth it only ever held when he talked about my sister's achievements. "She graduated summa cum laude. She scored in the 99th percentile on her GRE. She has 3 professors writing her letters of recommendation. She deserves more than you, Claire. She's earned it." The words hit me like physical blows. She deserves more than you. Not, she needs the car more, or she has better opportunities right now. But she deserves more than you, as a human being, as a daughter, as a person worthy of consideration. Emma reached across the table and placed her manicured hand over mine with practiced sisterly affection. "I promise I'll take really good care of it, Claire. And it's not like you really need a car, right? You can take the bus to your community college classes, and the bookstore is within walking distance of campus." Community college. She said it like it was some kind of personal failing, this 2-year institution where I had been working toward my associate degree while living at home and saving money. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my community college grades had opened doors they couldn't imagine. I looked around the table at the 3 people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, seeing them clearly perhaps for the first time in my 20 years. They weren't asking for my car. They were demanding it. They weren't considering my needs. They were dismissing them. They weren't treating me like family. They were treating me like an inconvenient obstacle to Emma's continued success. "Fine," I said, the word coming out flat and final. "You can have the car." The relief that washed over their faces was almost comical. Emma actually clapped her hands together like a delighted child, while my parents exchanged the kind of satisfied look that said they had handled another potential Claire problem with their usual efficiency. I stood up from the table, pulling the car keys from my pocket, along with the envelope that had been burning a hole in my backpack for 2 weeks. I placed both items on the table in front of Emma, watching her face light up as she reached for the keys. "Thank you so much, Claire," she squealed. "This means everything to me. You have no idea how much this is going to help my future." "You're right," I said quietly, pushing the envelope toward her as well. "I do want to help your future. So here, you should have this too." Emma looked at the envelope with confusion, noting the Harvard University logo in the corner. her name conspicuously absent from the address line. "What is this?" I smiled for what felt like the first time in months. "Open it." Emma had been born golden. Literally. Her hair caught sunlight like spun honey. Her eyes were the color of summer skies, and her smile could make adults forget whatever they were saying mid-sentence. I remembered watching from my crib as visitors cooed over the beautiful baby girl, their voices taking on that special tone reserved for something precious and perfect. By the time I arrived 2 years later, the family dynamic was already established. Emma was the princess, and I was the supporting cast member whose job was to make her shine brighter by comparison. The pattern started early and never wavered. Emma's first steps were documented with professional photography. Mine were captured on a blurry cell phone video that my mother recorded while simultaneously feeding Emma her afternoon snack. Emma's first words were written in a baby book with careful calligraphy. Mine were mentioned in passing during a phone call to my grandmother. "Emma is such a gifted child," became my mother's favorite conversation starter at neighborhood gatherings, parent-teacher conferences, and grocery store checkout lines. She would list Emma's achievements like a proud catalog: reading at age 3, piano recitals at 5, honor roll student by 7, student council president by 12. When people asked about me, Susan's response was always the same: practice deflection. Claire is sweet. She tries hard." The pause before sweet spoke volumes about how little there was to say about her second daughter. Emma's bedroom was a shrine to her accomplishments. Academic awards lined the walls in neat rows. Trophies from various competitions crowded the bookshelf, and certificates of achievement were framed with museum-quality precision. Her desk was always perfectly organized, topped with the latest laptop, and surrounded by college preparation books that our parents bought her years before she would actually need them. My room, by contrast, was an afterthought. Hand-me-down furniture that Emma had outgrown, walls decorated with posters I had bought at garage sales, and a desk cobbled together from an old door and 2 filing cabinets I had found at a thrift store. When friends came over, Emma's room was always part of the house tour. Mine was politely ignored. The favoritism wasn't malicious. It was simply matter of fact, like gravity or weather patterns. Emma was the child who validated my parents' belief that they were exceptional people raising an exceptional daughter. I was the child who reminded them that lightning didn't always strike twice in the same place. "Emma has such natural intelligence," David would brag to his golf buddies, conveniently forgetting the expensive tutors, test prep courses, and private coaching that had helped Emma achieve her natural success. "She just understands things in a way that other kids don't." The truth was more complicated. Emma was bright, certainly, but her achievements were as much the product of unlimited investment as they were of innate ability. While I worked part-time jobs to contribute to household expenses, Emma's after-school time was devoted to enrichment activities that cost more than most families spent on rent. While I studied at the kitchen table between helping with chores, Emma had a private tutor who came to the house 3 times a week. But the most painful difference wasn't in the opportunities we were given, it was in the expectations we were held to. Emma's B+ in calculus was celebrated as evidence of her challenging herself with advanced coursework. My A+ in the same subject was dismissed as proof that I wasn't pushing myself hard enough. "Community college is a perfectly respectable choice," my mother would tell her friends when they asked about my post-graduation plans, her tone suggesting it was anything but respectable. Not everyone is cut out for university-level work. The assumption that I wasn't cut out for challenging academics had become so ingrained in our family mythology that no one bothered to question it. When I brought home excellent grades, they were explained away as evidence that my classes were too easy. When I mentioned interest in transferring to a 4-year university, I was gently discouraged from setting my sights too high. "You don't want to set yourself up for disappointment," Susan would say, with the kind of protective concern that felt more like a cage than comfort. "It's better to be successful at something within your reach than to fail at something beyond your abilities." The message was clear. Emma was destined for greatness, while I was destined for adequacy. Emma's dreams were to be supported and nurtured. Mine were to be managed and contained. Even Emma had absorbed this family narrative so completely that she genuinely believed it was natural law. She wasn't cruel about her privileged position. Cruelty would have required her to recognize that her advantages came at someone else's expense. Instead, she moved through the world with the unconscious confidence of someone who had never been told that her dreams were too big or her goals too ambitious. "I'm so lucky to have supportive parents," she would tell her friends, never noticing that support was a finite resource in our household, and most of it flowed in her direction. The night before her 21st birthday, I had found her in her room, surrounded by graduate school acceptance letters and scholarship offers. glowing with the kind of happiness that comes from having the world align with your expectations. "Can you believe all of this is happening?" she had asked me, gesturing at the evidence of her success spread across her perfectly organized desk. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life. It's all so perfect." "Yeah," I had said, standing in the doorway between her bright future and my uncertain one. "Sometimes I feel exactly the same way." She had missed the irony completely. Living in Emma's shadow wasn't a gradual process. It was my natural habitat from birth. While she collected achievements like trophies, I collected the weight of never being quite enough, never being quite as much, never being quite as worthy of attention or investment or pride. I learned early that love in our house was a meritocracy, distributed according to accomplishments and potential, rather than given freely as a birthright. Emma earned love through straight A's in student government elections and piano competitions. I earned brief moments of tolerance through keeping quiet and not causing problems, and making myself useful in ways that didn't interfere with Emma's spotlight. The kitchen became my domain by necessity, rather than choice. While Emma practiced piano, or studied with her tutor, or attended enrichment programs, I helped Susan prepare meals, clean dishes, and manage the household tasks that kept our home running smoothly. Not because my parents asked me to, but because someone had to do it, and Emma was always too busy with more important things. "Claire's such a good helper," visitors would comment when they found me folding laundry or organizing the pantry while Emma entertained them with her latest academic triumph in the living room. The word helper stung more than they realized. It reduced me to a supporting role in my own life, a bit player whose purpose was to make other people's starring roles possible. School became my refuge, the one place where Emma's reputation didn't precede me and define my possibilities. But even there, the shadow followed. Teachers who had Emma in previous years would look at me with a mixture of hope and disappointment, waiting for signs of the exceptional intelligence that ran in the family, then adjusting their expectations downward when I proved to be merely bright rather than brilliant. "Are you planning to follow in your sister's footsteps?" became the question that haunted every parent-teacher conference, every academic counseling session, every casual conversation with family friends. The assumption was that Emma had established the family standard, and my job was to aspire to reach it. But I learned something my family never suspected. Being underestimated was a form of freedom. When no one expected greatness from me, I could pursue my own version of excellence without the pressure of living up to impossible standards. When no one was paying attention to my choices, I could make decisions based on what I wanted, rather than what would reflect well on the family reputation. My job at the campus bookstore became more than just a way to earn money. It became my introduction to a world where books were judged by their content rather than their prestige, where students struggled with genuine intellectual curiosity rather than performing success for parental approval. I discovered authors Emma had never heard of, engaged in discussions about ideas that went far beyond what was required for any class, and began to understand that there were many different ways to be intelligent. Professor Martinez, who taught my composition class, was the first adult who seemed to see something in me beyond my relationship to Emma. When I turned in essays that went far beyond the minimum requirements, she didn't express surprise that the quiet girl from the back row could write with insight and passion. Instead, she started giving me additional reading suggestions, inviting me to attend guest lectures, and eventually suggesting that I might want to consider transferring to a more challenging academic environment. "You have a gift for analysis," she told me after class one day, holding my essay on social justice literature with the kind of respect I had never seen anyone show for my work. "Your writing shows depth of thought and originality of perspective. Have you considered applying to 4-year universities?" The suggestion was so foreign to my understanding of my own capabilities that I initially dismissed it. Transfer to a university? That was the kind of opportunity that existed for people like Emma, not people like me. But Professor Martinez persisted. She helped me research transfer programs, guided me through application processes, and eventually convinced me to take the SAT, despite my protests that I was too old, and it was too late, and I wasn't smart enough to compete with students who had been preparing for elite universities their entire lives. The night I got my SAT scores, I sat in my car in the parking lot of the testing center, staring at numbers that didn't match anything I had been taught to believe about myself. 1580 out of 1600, 99th percentile, higher than Emma's scores, which I had overheard my parents bragging about at dinner parties for years. I drove home in a daze, the score report burning like a secret in my backpack. These numbers represented possibility, opportunity, a future I had never allowed myself to imagine. But they also represented a fundamental challenge to everything my family believed about who I was and what I was capable of becoming. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I would apply to Harvard, not because I expected to get in, but because I needed to know if the person Professor Martinez saw when she looked at me was real or just wishful thinking. I would keep it secret until I knew for sure. The Harvard application felt like a declaration of war against everything I had been taught to believe about myself. I filled it out in secret, working late shifts at the bookstore to pay the application fee, writing essays in the campus library where no one from my family would accidentally discover what I was doing. The personal statement was the hardest part. How do you explain a lifetime of being overlooked without sounding bitter? How do you present your achievements when you've been trained to minimize them? How do you convince admissions officers that you belong at their institution when your own family doesn't think you belong at any institution more challenging than community college? I wrote 17 drafts before I found the words that felt true. I have spent my life learning in the margins, finding excellence in unexpected places, developing intellectual curiosity without encouragement, and discovering that the most valuable education often happens in the spaces between official recognition. My family's story has always been about my sister's achievements, but my story is about learning to recognize my own worth even when no one else was looking for it. Professor Martinez helped me gather letters of recommendation, explaining to my other instructors that I was applying for transfer opportunities without revealing the specific schools I had targeted. She understood instinctively that this application represented more than academic ambition. It was an act of rebellion against a lifetime of being told I wasn't enough. The hardest part wasn't the application itself, but maintaining the fiction of being the family underachiever, while secretly nurturing dreams that would have shocked everyone who thought they knew me. I continued to downplay my grades, deflect questions about my future plans, and watch as my parents poured time and money and emotional investment into Emma's graduate school applications, while assuming I would continue at community college indefinitely. Claire seems comfortable with her limitations, I overheard Susan tell her sister during one of their weekly phone calls. Not everyone can be academic like Emma. Claire's more of a practical, steady kind of person. The words stung, but they also strengthened my resolve. I wasn't applying to Harvard to prove anything to my family. I was applying to prove something to myself, to find out if the voice in my head that whispered, "You're capable of more," was trustworthy, or if I had been deluding myself with fantasies that would crumble under real scrutiny. The interview was scheduled for a Saturday morning in December at a coffee shop downtown, where I was unlikely to run into anyone who knew my family. The alumnus who interviewed me was a woman in her 40s who had graduated from Harvard Law School and now worked as a public interest attorney. "Tell me about a book that changed your perspective," she said, settling into the chair across from me with genuine curiosity in her eyes. I talked about James Baldwin's essays, about how his writing had helped me understand the difference between intelligence and education, between achievement and worth. I explained how reading his work had taught me that some of the most important learning happens outside official institutions, in communities and conversations that aren't recognized by traditional academic structures. She listened with the kind of focused attention I rarely receive from adults, asking follow-up questions that suggested she was genuinely interested in my thoughts, rather than simply fulfilling an obligation. "You have an interesting perspective on education," she said as our conversation wound down. "Most applicants talk about what they want to get from Harvard. You've talked mostly about what you hope to contribute." I hadn't realized I had been doing that, but as I reflected on our conversation, I understood what she meant. While Emma's academic pursuits had always been about collecting achievements, my intellectual journey had been about finding meaning. I wasn't seeking validation from prestigious institutions. I was seeking the tools to make a difference in the world. The waiting period after submitting my application was torture. Every day I checked the mail before anyone else in my family could see what arrived, terrified that an acceptance or rejection letter would blow my cover before I was ready to reveal what I had been doing. Meanwhile, Emma's graduate school acceptances arrived like a parade of triumph. Each envelope was opened with ceremony, each acceptance celebrated with family dinners and proud phone calls to relatives and Facebook posts that tagged me as the supportive sister, cheering from the sidelines. I played my role perfectly, offering congratulations that were genuine, even as they felt like funeral arrangements for my own dreams. If Emma got into prestigious programs with the full support of our family's resources and expectations, what hope did I have of competing from the shadows? The Harvard letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, tucked between a credit card offer and the electric bill. I almost missed it, my eyes scanning past the familiar logo before my brain registered what I was seeing. My hands shook as I opened the envelope, alone in the kitchen while everyone else was either at work or school. "Dear Claire, congratulations. I am delighted to inform you that you have been admitted to Harvard University as a transfer student for the fall semester. I read the letter 3 times before the words sank in. Not only had I been accepted, I had been offered a full scholarship based on academic merit and financial need. Room, board, tuition, everything covered for the next 2 years as I completed my bachelor's degree. I was going to Harvard. Me. The family underachiever. The practical one. The sister who wasn't supposed to dream beyond community college and part-time jobs. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my backpack, next to my car keys and my wallet, and all the other ordinary things that suddenly felt extraordinary. I would keep this secret for just a little while longer, until the right moment came to share it. I had no idea that moment would come in the form of my sister's birthday demand. Emma's fingers trembled as she unfolded the Harvard acceptance letter, her eyes scanning the text with the kind of desperate speed that suggested she was hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something that made sense. The birthday cake sat forgotten between us, its cheerful candles now seeming absurd against the sudden gravity in the room. "This is addressed to Claire," Emma said, her voice small and confused. She looked up at me like she was seeing a stranger. "Why do you have a letter addressed to Claire from Harvard?" My mother reached across the table, her manicured fingers plucking the letter from Emma's hands with the kind of automatic authority she had always used when something in our family needed to be managed or controlled. She read silently, her expression shifting through confusion, disbelief, and finally settling into something that looked almost like panic. "This says you've been accepted," Susan said, holding the letter like it might be contaminated, "with a full scholarship for fall semester." She paused, her lawyer's mind catching up to the implications. "Claire, this is dated 3 weeks ago. You've been hiding this from us for 3 weeks?" David leaned over his wife's shoulder, reading the letter with the kind of focus he usually reserved for business contracts or financial statements. I watched his face as he processed the information, saw the exact moment when he realized what this meant for the family narrative that had shaped all our lives. "I don't understand," he said, looking at me like I had just performed a magic trick that violated the laws of physics. "How did you even apply to Harvard? When did you take the SATs? How did you write the essays? How did you get the letters of recommendation?" The questions came rapid fire, each one carrying decades of assumptions about my capabilities, my ambitions, my very identity. I had spent 20 years watching them underestimate me, and now I was watching them struggle to recalibrate their understanding of who I was and what I was capable of becoming. "I've been working on it for 2 years, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Professor Martinez helped me with the application process. I took the SATs last spring. I wrote the essays during my breaks at the bookstore." Emma was staring at me like I had just revealed that I was secretly an alien from another planet. "But you go to community college," she said, as if stating this fact would somehow undo the letter that sat between us on the table. "You work at a bookstore. You don't even talk about wanting to go to university." "I didn't talk about it because no one ever asked what I wanted," I said, "and because I learned early that my dreams weren't considered worth discussing in this family." The silence that followed was the kind that felt dangerous, full of realizations that no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. I could see each of them processing the implications of what I had just revealed, not just about my academic achievements, but about the family dynamics that had made those achievements seem impossible. Susan was the first to speak, her voice carrying that tone of careful control she used when she was trying to manage a situation that threatened to spiral beyond her influence. "Claire, this is wonderful news, of course, but you have to understand that this changes things. Emma's graduate program requires reliable transportation, and now with your opportunity, perhaps there's a way we can work something out that benefits everyone." The audacity of it took my breath away, even faced with evidence that I had achieved something remarkable, something that surpassed Emma's undergraduate accomplishments. My mother's first instinct was to figure out how to make it serve Emma's needs. "Actually, Mom, it doesn't change anything about the car," I said, standing up from the table and pulling my backpack over my shoulder. "Emma can have it. I'm moving to Cambridge in August, and I won't need a car there anyway." David's business mind was already working the angles. "Claire, we need to discuss this as a family. Harvard is expensive, even with a scholarship. There are living expenses, books, travel costs. We should sit down and figure out how to support both our daughters' educational goals." The offer of support would have meant everything to me 6 months ago. Now it felt like too little, too late. A desperate attempt to maintain control over a situation that had already moved beyond their influence. "The scholarship covers everything," I said. "Room, board, tuition, books, even a modest living stipend. I won't need financial support from the family." Emma suddenly burst into tears, not the delicate tears that had always earned her comfort and attention, but raw, ugly sobs that seemed to come from some deep place of confusion and loss. "This isn't fair," she cried. I worked so hard. I did everything right. I followed all the rules. How did you get into Harvard when I didn't even try for Harvard? It was the first honest thing she had said all day, and it broke my heart, because I could see the little girl who had been raised to believe that following the rules and being perfect would guarantee her everything she wanted from life. You didn't try for Harvard because you didn't need to, I said gently. You had parents who believed in your dreams and supported your ambitions and told you every day that you were capable of anything. I applied to Harvard because I had to prove to myself that I was worth more than everyone thought I was. I picked up my car keys and placed them in Emma's hand, closing her fingers around them with a gesture that felt like benediction. Happy birthday, Emma. The car is yours. As I walked toward the door, I heard my father's voice behind me, smaller than I had ever heard it before. Claire, wait. We need to talk about this. I turned back to look at the 3 people who had shaped my understanding of my own worth, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in my life. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by the revelation that their family story had been built on assumptions that were fundamentally wrong. We've been talking about this my whole life, I said. You just weren't listening. The hours that followed my revelation passed in a surreal blur of phone calls, hushed conversations, and the kind of family crisis management that our household had never needed before. I retreated to my room, leaving Emma's birthday celebration in ruins, and my parents scrambling to understand how their carefully constructed family narrative had crumbled so completely. From behind my closed door, I could hear fragments of desperate conversations. David on the phone with his brother, trying to explain how the daughter they had written off as academically limited had somehow gotten into Harvard. Susan calling her sister, her voice shrill with confusion and what sounded almost like betrayal, as if my achievements were somehow an act of deception directed against her. We just don't understand how this could have happened, I heard my mother saying, her words carrying the tone of someone discussing a natural disaster or medical emergency. Claire never showed any signs of this kind of capability. The word capability hung in the air like an accusation, as if intelligence was something visible, something that should have announced itself through the channels they recognized as legitimate, as if the quiet girl who did her homework at the kitchen table and worked at the bookstore and never complained about hand-me-down clothes couldn't possibly have been harboring dreams that exceeded their expectations. Emma knocked on my door around 9 o'clock, her voice tentative in a way I had never heard before. Claire, can I come in? I opened the door to find my sister standing in the hallway, still wearing her birthday dress, but looking somehow deflated, like a balloon slowly losing air. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was something else in her expression, a confusion so profound it seemed to have shaken her understanding of reality itself. She settled on my bed with the careful movements of someone who was no longer sure of her welcome anywhere. I keep reading your letter, she said, pulling the Harvard acceptance from her purse where she had apparently been carrying it around like evidence of something she couldn't quite comprehend. It says you scored a 1580 on the SAT. I nodded, waiting for whatever was coming next. That's higher than my score, she said quietly. I got a 1520, and Mom and Dad acted like I had broken some kind of record. They bragged about it at dinner parties for months. The admission cost her something. Emma had built her identity around being the smart one, the accomplished one, the one who excelled at everything academic. Learning that I had quietly surpassed her standardized test scores was like discovering that gravity worked differently than she had always believed. When did you get so smart? She asked, and there was genuine bewilderment in her voice. I mean, you were always okay at school, but nothing special. Nothing that would suggest you could get into Harvard. I sat down beside her on the bed where I had spent countless nights listening to my parents praise her achievements through the thin walls. I was always this smart, Emma. You just never noticed because no one was looking for it. But you never acted smart, she protested. You never talked about intellectual stuff, never showed off your grades, never competed for academic honors. If you were capable of this, why didn't you act like it? The question revealed so much about how Emma understood intelligence, as performance, as competition, as something that existed to impress other people, rather than as a private relationship with learning and growth. Because acting smart in this family meant competing with you, I said. And competing with you meant risking the little bit of love and attention I did receive. It was safer to be the supportive sister who didn't threaten your position as the family genius. Emma was quiet for a long time, processing implications that seemed to be rewriting her understanding of our entire childhood. Do you hate me? She finally asked, her voice small and vulnerable. The question surprised me. No, Emma, I don't hate you. I hate the system that made us both believe that love was scarce and intelligence was a competition, and there could only be one successful daughter in our family. She started crying again, but these tears were different. Not the frustrated tears of earlier, but the kind of deep, grieving tears that come when you realize that something you thought was solid and permanent has been built on sand. "I don't know who I am if I'm not the smart one," she whispered. "That's been my whole identity since I was little. The pretty one, the smart one, the one with potential. If you're smarter than me, and better at hiding it, and more independent, and going to Harvard without anyone's help, what does that make me?" I put my arm around my sister, feeling her shake with the effort of confronting questions she had never been forced to ask herself. "It makes you human," I said. "It makes you someone who can figure out who you want to be instead of who everyone expects you to be." Downstairs, I could hear my parents' voices rising in what sounded like their first real fight in years, the careful politeness that usually characterized their relationship cracking under the pressure of having to reconsider everything they thought they knew about their children. 20 years, Susan," David was saying, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been self-recrimination. "We spent 20 years treating her like she was less capable, less promising, less worth investing in. And all this time she was lying to us," my mother interrupted, but even she didn't sound convinced by her own words. Emma and I sat in my small room, listening to our parents grapple with the realization that their family story had been fundamentally wrong. The golden child and the overlooked daughter, the genius and the average student, the deserving one and the one who should be grateful for scraps, all of it revealed as fiction. "What happens now?" Emma asked. I looked around my room, at the hand-me-down furniture and garage sale posters, and the bookshelf where I had hidden my acceptance letter. In 4 months, I would leave all of this behind for a life that I had built entirely for myself. "Now we find out who we really are," I said. The next morning brought a family meeting that felt more like a tribunal. My parents had spent the night in what sounded like intense strategic planning sessions, their voices murmuring behind their bedroom door until well past midnight. Now they sat across from me at the kitchen table with the kind of grim determination usually reserved for discussing terminal diagnoses or bankruptcy filings. Emma was notably absent, having fled to her boyfriend's house after our late-night conversation, claiming she needed time to process everything. I suspected she needed time to decide which version of herself she wanted to present when the family reassembled. Susan had prepared what looked like talking points, written in her careful handwriting on a legal pad, that suggested this conversation was being approached as a negotiation rather than a family discussion. David sat beside her with his reading glasses on, a stack of financial documents spread in front of him like evidence in a court case. "Claire," my mother began, her voice carrying that tone of reasonable authority she used in her law practice, "we need to discuss some practical matters regarding your situation." The word situation made my Harvard acceptance sound like an unwanted pregnancy or a minor legal infraction, something that needed to be managed rather than celebrated. "What we don't understand," David said, adjusting his glasses and consulting his notes, "is why you felt the need to pursue this opportunity in secret. If you were academically capable of elite university admission, we would have supported those ambitions." The statement was so fundamentally untrue that I almost laughed. "Would you have?" "Because when I mentioned wanting to transfer to a 4-year university, you told me I should be realistic about my limitations. When I brought home excellent grades, you explained them away as evidence that my classes were too easy. When I asked about the college fund that had been established for me, I was told it had been redirected to Emma's private school tuition because she had more potential." Susan's expression tightened with the kind of defensive irritation that appeared whenever her parenting choices were questioned. "We made decisions based on the information available to us at the time." Emma showed clear signs of exceptional ability from an early age. You were a different kind of child." "What kind of child was I exactly?" I asked, genuinely curious about how they had categorized me in their minds. My parents exchanged the kind of look that married couples develop after decades of communicating without words. David cleared his throat with the discomfort of someone being asked to articulate thoughts that sounded reasonable in his head, but ugly when spoken aloud. "You were more practical," he said carefully. "Less driven by academic ambition, more focused on helping others, content with simpler goals. We thought we were being supportive of your natural inclinations." "My natural inclinations toward mediocrity," I clarified. "That's not what we meant," Susan protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "It's exactly what you meant," I said. "You decided when I was young that Emma was the academic achiever, and I was the helpful one. You invested in her potential and managed my limitations. You celebrated her successes and minimized mine. You built a family system where love and support were distributed according to achievement. And then you were surprised when I learned not to share my achievements with you." The conversation was interrupted by Emma's return, her face showing the strain of a sleepless night and what looked like extensive crying. She moved through the kitchen like someone walking through a minefield, hyper-aware of the emotional explosives that might detonate with any wrong step. "I've been thinking," she announced, settling into the chair beside me with unusual hesitancy. "About everything that happened yesterday. About how we've all been living." She pulled out her phone and showed us a series of screenshots. College admission statistics, scholarship requirements, transfer program prerequisites. I spent all night researching what Claire had to do to get into Harvard as a transfer student. Do you know how hard that is? How exceptional her grades had to be? How competitive the application process is? My parents looked at the statistics with the kind of careful attention they usually reserved for investment portfolios or legal briefs. I watched their faces as they processed the numerical evidence of what I had accomplished, saw the moment when the data forced them to reconsider their assumptions about my capabilities. Claire had to maintain a perfect GPA while working part-time and living at home and dealing with— Emma paused, seeming to struggle with how to characterize our family dynamics. Dealing with being treated like the consolation prize daughter. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. The consolation prize daughter. It was brutal in its accuracy, capturing something about my position in our family that I had never been able to articulate so clearly. Susan's face went white. "Emma, that's not fair. We love both our daughters equally." "No, Mom, you don't," Emma said, her voice carrying a certainty that seemed to surprise even her. "You love us differently. You've always loved us differently. You love me like I'm a reflection of your success as parents. You love Claire like she's an obligation you're fulfilling adequately." The distinction was so precise, so devastatingly accurate, that no one knew how to respond to it. We sat in silence, the weight of Emma's honesty settling over the kitchen table like dust after a demolition. David finally spoke, his voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "Claire, we may have made some mistakes in how we approached your education and development. If we underestimated your potential, that was our failure, not yours." It was the closest thing to an apology I had ever received from either of my parents, and it should have felt like vindication. Instead, it felt like grieving, for the childhood I might have had, for the support that could have made my journey easier, for the family relationships that had been damaged by decades of unacknowledged favoritism. "The question now," I said, looking around the table at these three people who were finally seeing me clearly, "is what we do with the truth." The revelation of my Harvard acceptance had cracked open something that had been sealed for 20 years, and now truths were spilling out like water from a broken dam. Over the following days, conversations that had been buried under decades of careful family management began to surface, each one revealing another layer of the dynamic that had shaped all our lives. I found myself remembering moments I had forgotten, or misunderstood at the time. The way my mother's face would tighten slightly when teachers praised my work at parent conferences. The way my father would change the subject whenever I mentioned academic interests that went beyond what he considered my appropriate level. The way Emma would look confused and almost threatened on the rare occasions when I received recognition for anything intellectual. I used to hide my test scores, I told Professor Martinez during our weekly coffee meeting, the conversation that had started as academic mentoring but had evolved into something more like therapy. Even when I was young, I learned that bringing home excellent grades created tension in the house. It was easier to just not mention them. Professor Martinez stirred her coffee thoughtfully, her expression mixing sadness with anger. "Claire, what you're describing is a form of intellectual abuse. Your family trained you to hide your gifts to preserve their comfort." The word abuse felt too strong at first, too dramatic for what had felt like simple family dynamics. But as I reflected on 20 years of learning to minimize myself, to make myself smaller so that others could feel bigger, I began to understand that damage didn't always come from active cruelty. Sometimes it came from systematic neglect of what made you extraordinary. Emma had been struggling with her own recalibration. The graduate program that had seemed so important a week earlier now felt hollow to her. Another achievement pursued not because it aligned with her genuine interests, but because it was what was expected of the family's designated achiever. "I don't even know if I want to study literature," she confessed during one of our late-night conversations that had become regular since the birthday revelation. "I chose it because I was good at writing essays and professors liked my analysis. But I've never thought about whether it makes me happy or whether I have anything meaningful to contribute to the field." It was startling to realize that Emma, for all her academic success, had never been encouraged to develop the kind of self-awareness that comes from having to fight for your dreams. Her path had been so smooth, so supported, so predetermined, that she had never been forced to question whether it was actually her path or just the path that had been laid out for her. "What would make you happy?" I asked her, and watched her face crumple with the realization that she genuinely didn't know. "I have no idea," she whispered. "I've spent so long being what everyone expected me to be that I don't know who I actually am underneath all the achievements." The irony wasn't lost on me. Emma's privileges had been as limiting as my neglect, just in different ways. She had been given every opportunity to succeed, but no opportunity to fail, explore, or discover her authentic self. I had been given no support, but complete freedom to develop my interests according to my own curiosity and values. My parents were having their own crisis of understanding. David had started making awkward attempts to connect with me about intellectual topics, bringing up news articles or book recommendations with the desperate enthusiasm of someone trying to build a relationship from scratch with a person he realized he had never actually known. "I saw a review of this book about social justice movements," he said one morning, showing me a newspaper clipping with the kind of hopeful uncertainty usually reserved for first dates. "I thought it might be something you'd find interesting." The gesture was touching and tragic in equal measure. A successful businessman in his 50s trying to figure out how to talk to the daughter whose inner life had been invisible to him for 2 decades. Susan's recalibration was more complicated. As a lawyer, she was used to building cases based on evidence, and the evidence of my capabilities challenged fundamental assumptions about her effectiveness as a mother. She had spent 20 years believing she was nurturing her daughters according to their natural abilities and inclinations. Now she was being forced to confront the possibility that her assessment had been not just wrong, but actively harmful. "I keep thinking about all the times you mentioned wanting to do something, and I talked you out of it," she said, during what had become our first real mother-daughter conversation. "The summer program at the state university, the advanced math track, the writing competition. I thought I was protecting you from disappointment." "You were protecting yourself from having to reconsider your assumptions about me," I said. Not unkindly, but without the soft edges I usually put on truths that might hurt feelings. She nodded, accepting the criticism with the kind of professional grace she brought to acknowledging mistakes in legal strategy. "What can we do to fix this? How can we support you now?" The question revealed how little she understood about what I needed. After 20 years of building independence, resilience, and self-reliance, I didn't need support in the traditional sense. I needed space to become whoever I was meant to be, without the weight of their delayed recognition or their guilt about missed opportunities. "You can let me go to Harvard without trying to manage the experience," I said. "You can let me succeed without making it about you, and you can figure out how to love Emma for who she is rather than what she achieves." It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was the answer that might actually heal our family. The ripple effects of my revelation spread through our extended family and social circle like shockwaves, each conversation forcing my parents to confront their narrative about their daughters from a new angle. Suddenly, the family story they had been telling for 20 years, successful parents raising one exceptional daughter and one average daughter, no longer made sense to anyone who heard it. My grandmother was the first to voice what everyone else was thinking. During our weekly family dinner, she looked directly at my mother with the kind of sharp clarity that comes from 8 decades of observing family dynamics and said, "Susan, how exactly did you miss that your daughter was Harvard material?" The question hung in the air like an indictment. My mother's careful explanations about supporting each daughter's natural inclinations sounded increasingly hollow when delivered to relatives who had watched Emma receive private tutoring, test preparation, and unlimited educational investment while I worked part-time jobs and studied at the kitchen table. "We always knew Claire was bright," Susan said, her voice carrying the defensive tone of someone whose professional competence was being questioned. "But she seemed more interested in practical applications than academic theory." Uncle Mark, David's brother, who had always been the family skeptic, raised an eyebrow. "Practical applications? She got into Harvard, Susan, with a full scholarship. That's not practical. That's exceptional." The extended family's reaction revealed something my parents hadn't anticipated. Other people had noticed my capabilities even when they hadn't. Cousins shared memories of conversations where I had demonstrated insights that impressed them. Family friends recalled academic achievements that my parents had minimized or ignored. Teachers from my high school, when contacted for recommendations, had expressed surprise that I hadn't pursued more competitive universities initially. "Your daughter was one of the most intellectually curious students I ever taught," my high school English teacher told my mother during a chance encounter at the grocery store. "I always wondered why she didn't apply to more challenging programs." Each conversation forced my parents to realize that their assessment of my abilities hadn't been objective observation. It had been willful blindness, a systematic refusal to see evidence that contradicted their preferred family narrative. Emma was dealing with her own cascade of consequences. Her graduate program acceptance, which had felt like validation of her worth, now felt tainted by the revelation that she had achieved it with advantages I had never received. Her relationship with her fiancé became strained as she questioned whether he loved her for herself or for the family status she represented. "Do you think he would have proposed if he had known the truth about our family finances?" she asked me one evening, turning her engagement ring nervously around her finger. If he had known that I wasn't actually the heir to significant family wealth, the question revealed how much of her identity had been built on external validation rather than internal worth. Emma was discovering what I had known my entire life, that love based on achievement or status is conditional and fragile. "If he wouldn't love you without the money, then he doesn't really love you with it," I said. "He loves what you represent, not who you are." She ended the engagement 2 weeks later, returning the ring with a note that simply said she needed time to figure out who she was outside of other people's expectations. My parents' marriage was also showing stress fractures under the weight of their realization. David had started questioning other family decisions, wondering what else they might have gotten wrong in their assessment of their children's needs and capabilities. Susan, meanwhile, seemed to be experiencing something like professional shame. As someone whose career was built on careful analysis and sound judgment, her complete misreading of her own daughter's potential felt like evidence of fundamental incompetence. "I keep thinking about the college fund," David said during one of our increasingly frequent family discussions. "We redirected your money to Emma's private school because we thought she had more academic potential. How do we make that right?" The question was practical, but also philosophical. How do you compensate someone for 20 years of systematically lowered expectations? How do you repay investment that should have been made in childhood development, in confidence building, in the kind of support that creates lifelong resilience? "You can't make it right," I said, not to be cruel but to be honest. "You can acknowledge it was wrong, and you can do better going forward. But you can't give me back the childhood where I felt valued for my intelligence instead of tolerated for my usefulness." The Harvard scholarship had solved my practical problems: tuition, housing, the financial barriers that might have prevented me from attending. But it couldn't solve the emotional damage of growing up feeling like the consolation prize in my own family. "What do you need from us now?" Susan asked, her lawyer's mind still looking for actionable solutions to complex human problems. I thought about the question seriously. What did I need from parents who were finally seeing me clearly, but 20 years too late? "I need you to let me go without guilt-tripping me about abandoning the family," I said. "I need you to support Emma in figuring out who she is without comparing her to me. And I need you to understand that my success isn't about proving you wrong. It's about proving to myself that I was right about my own worth all along." The hardest part wasn't their delayed recognition of my capabilities. The hardest part was learning to trust my own judgment about my worth when it had been undermined for so long by the people who were supposed to nurture it. But I was learning, and in 4 months, I would be at Harvard, surrounded by people who recognized intellectual curiosity and academic achievement as valuable in their own right. August arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that makes everything feel suspended in amber, but I moved through my final weeks at home with a clarity I had never experienced before. My belongings were packed into 2 suitcases and a trunk, not because I owned so little, but because I was choosing to travel light, carrying only what belonged to the person I was becoming, rather than artifacts from the person I had been forced to be. The family dynamics had settled into a new, uncomfortable equilibrium. My parents moved around me with the careful deference usually reserved for honored guests or fragile invalids, their attempts at supportive parenting feeling awkward after 20 years of benign neglect. Emma had deferred her graduate program for a year, announcing she wanted to travel and find herself, a luxury that felt almost obscene to someone who had been finding herself in secret for years. "I keep thinking about all the conversations we never had," David said on my last morning, finding me in the kitchen making coffee before anyone else was awake. "About books, ideas, what you were thinking about when you seemed so quiet." I looked at my father, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time as an adult. He was smaller than I remembered, diminished somehow by the realization that he had spent 2 decades living with a daughter he had never bothered to know. "I was thinking about everything," I said, "about social justice in literature, and how communities form, and why some families thrive while others just survive. I was thinking about whether intelligence is inherited or developed, about whether love should be conditional on achievement, about what it means to build a life that matters." He stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language, this interior world I had been inhabiting while he was focused on Emma's external accomplishments. "I wish we had known," he said quietly. "You could have known," I replied. not unkindly, but without absolving him of responsibility. You just weren't interested in finding out. The distinction was important. My intellectual development hadn't been hidden. It had been ignored. My achievements hadn't been secret. They had been dismissed. My potential hadn't been suppressed. It had been systematically underestimated by people who confused quiet confidence with lack of ambition. Emma found me later that morning, sitting on the front porch with my Harvard acceptance letter, reading it one more time before I left for a life none of us had seen coming. "Are you scared?" she asked, settling beside me on the steps where we had spent countless childhood afternoons. "Terrified," I admitted, "but not of Harvard. I'm scared of succeeding so completely that I prove everything I've always believed about this family's capacity for love." She was quiet for a moment, processing the implication. "You think if you do really well, it will prove that we only love achievement, not people, don't you?" I asked. Emma considered this with the kind of serious self-reflection she had been forced to develop over the past few months. "I think we're all going to have to learn how to love people, instead of loving what they accomplish. And that includes you learning to believe you deserve love, even when you're not proving how smart you are." The observation was startlingly perceptive, revealing how much Emma had grown in her understanding of our family's pathology. She was right. I had learned to earn love through achievement just as much as she had, just in secret rather than in the spotlight. Professor Martinez came to say goodbye, bringing a book of essays by women writers who had overcome systemic barriers to intellectual recognition. "For when you need reminders that you're part of a long tradition of brilliance that was underestimated," she said, hugging me with the fierce pride of a mentor watching her students step into a larger world. "Thank you," I said, and the words carried the weight of everything she had made possible. Not just the Harvard acceptance, but the confidence to believe I deserved it. The drive to Cambridge felt like crossing into foreign territory. My mother rode shotgun while David drove, both of them maintaining the kind of careful conversation usually reserved for diplomatic missions. Emma had chosen to stay home, claiming she wasn't ready to see me disappear into the life they were all still learning to understand. As we pulled onto Harvard's campus, I felt something shift inside my chest, not the anxious excitement I had expected, but a deep sense of coming home to a place I had never been, but somehow belonged to. The buildings looked exactly like the photographs, but being there felt like stepping into a future I had built entirely for myself. "This is really happening," Susan said, staring at students moving through the yard with the casual confidence of people who belonged in places of intellectual excellence. "Yes," I said, "it really is." We unloaded my belongings in the dormitory that would be my home for the next 2 years, my parents marveling at the resources available to me, the library system, the research opportunities, the professors whose names they recognized from book covers and news articles. When it was time for them to leave, we stood in my new room, sparse but full of possibility, and tried to figure out how to say goodbye to a family relationship that had been fundamentally altered by truth. "Call us," David said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty about whether I would want to maintain contact with parents who were still learning how to see me clearly. "I will," I promised, "but I'm not calling to report my grades or ask for approval. I'm calling because I want to, when I want to, as the person I'm becoming." It was the first boundary I had ever established with my family, and it felt like the beginning of real freedom. After they left, I sat in my room looking out at a campus full of students who had been told their entire lives that they were capable of extraordinary things. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who wouldn't be surprised by my intelligence, who wouldn't need me to hide my capabilities to preserve their comfort. I was finally free to be as smart as I actually was,